And today we have a special speaker. Jason, you're very popular, as you can see. And also we have a fantastic announcement to make. And for that, we are delighted to welcome our wonderful Dean of the College of Literature, Science, and the Arts, Andrew D. Martin. D. Martin is a professor of political science and statistics, and he's a leading authority in the study of judicial decision-making, with special emphasis on the US Supreme Court and the lower federal courts. And drawing on his extensive knowledge, expertise in political methodology and applied statistics, he developed with his colleague Kevin Quinn the widely used Martin-Quinn scores to measure ideology on the US Supreme Court. A graduate of the College of William and Mary and Washington University, D. Martin joined the University of Michigan in 2014. And as Dean of LSA, he has emphasized the importance of scholarship and increased access and inclusion for all students. His priorities include engaged learning opportunities like study abroad and internships, which led to the creation of the LSA Opportunity Hub, which is the college's first space dedicated to helping students connect their liberal arts education with their goals and aspirations. And as you can tell, his vision and his goals closely align with our Human Rights Center's mission, and we appreciate his continued support for our activities. So without any further ado, please join me in welcoming Dean Andrew D. Martin.
Thank you, Keo. Thank you very much, Keo, and good afternoon, everyone. It is my honor to be here today for this lecture and for this opportunity to recognize my friends Robert Donia and Jane Ritter. I am pleased to announce that they have established the Robert J. Donia Fellowship, a new fund to support graduate students who are engaged in research on the history of human rights. This gift will be a bridge between the Donia Human Rights Center and the Department of History, broadening understanding of the history of human rights issues. The work that these fellows will foster an interdisciplinary community and strengthen our engagement around campus and around the globe. In 2016, with the founding of the center, the University of Michigan took a big step in programming, research support, and student engagement focused on promoting greater understanding of contemporary human rights issues among our students, faculty, and the broader public. Now, with the addition of the Donia Fellowship, graduate students will have exposure beyond the University of Michigan campus, conducting research and presenting their work around the world and within the United States to build the historical context of these issues. Bob and Jane, we are incredibly grateful for your steadfast commitment and your generosity to the college and to the University of Michigan. Thank you both very much. Now I will turn to today's lecturer, Jason De León, Associate Professor of Anthropology and Director of the Undocumented Migration Project. Professor De León was awarded the MacArthur Genius Grant in 2017 for his work on the Undocumented Migration Project, a long-term anthropological study of clandestine migration between Mexico and the United States that uses a combination of ethnographic, visual, archaeological, and forensic approaches to understand this social process. He has published numerous academic articles, and his work with the UMP has been featured in a variety of popular media outlets. You can see examples of Jason's photographic work on exhibit in the gallery here on Weiser 10, just outside of this room. His project has focused on documenting the daily lives of Honduran smugglers who profit from transporting undocumented migrants across Mexico. In this talk, he will discuss the relationship between transnational gangs and the human smuggling industry, and he'll outline the complicated role that photography plays as a field method and data source in this violent and ethically challenging ethnographic context. Please join me in welcoming Professor De León.
Thank you so much, Dean Martin, for that introduction, and thank you to the Donia Human Rights Center and Keo and Brenna and Natasha for inviting me here and for also allowing us to install an exhibition in the hallway. And I want to thank Lucy Cahill and Nicole Smith for especially Lucy for all of the work that she did for the installation. I just watched. I felt like. And I want to thank whatever classes, including my own, that are offering extra credit for students to be here today. So thank you. All right. Soldiers and kings. You want to make a picture of this? Warlock asks me. A small flame materializes and begins to warm a crack rock that's cradled in the contour of a repurposed aluminum beer can. He takes a hit and releases a powdery cloud. He tilts his head away from me slightly so that the smoke doesn't go right into my face. Go ahead and take a picture, Warlock says, in English. That's an accented hybrid of the Bronx and Honduran Garifuna, Afro-Honduran. I got all these pictures already, man, I say. This is kind of boring. Ha ha ha, he says. This shit's crazy, but it relaxes me. You complain, though, about not being able to sleep at night. You think maybe it's all this cocaine? He smiles at me and says, maybe. Warlock is a complex and funny dude. A former child soldier in the Honduran military who migrated to the United States as a teenager. Now in his early 30s, he learned English while incarcerated for almost a decade in the United States for a series of violent felonies. Once paroled, he started doing dirt in Mexico: robbery, assault, drug dealing, and much, much worse. If you ask him, though, he will tell you that he prefers smuggling his fellow Hondurans. It's safer, it pays better, and is a lot less stressful. Smuggling people gives him less nightmares than the other stuff, the crazy stuff. No hay problema. Toma unas fotos. Take some photos, bro. Firme, he says. After months of this, I am now expected to always be taking pictures. The sparse room is poorly lit by a bare light bulb and the pulsing television. I'm shooting at 6400 ISO, pushing the film, yes, film, 4 stops with an aperture set to 1.2. Click, wind, click, wind, click, wind. Shooting with film means not getting distracted by staring at the back of my camera, what digital photographers call chimping, to check my exposure. You just keep shooting and find out later if you got something interesting from that particular moment. Tupac Shakur rattles out from the room directly below us. His voice is mixed with the cackling and the shit-talking that accompanies the slamming of dominoes onto a table. Warlock's soldiers are downstairs partying. It's always College Friday here in the safe house, especially right now because business is slow. Pinche Trump. Goddamn Trump, he says. Nobody wants to come because they're afraid they're going to get deported right away. And this was in the middle of last year. Still, even when there are clients to move, there's a lot of drinking, smoking, and partying. It's the same scene every single night. I take pictures of these guys partying, and so do they. Portraits, selfies, Snapchats. I have enough images to do an entire book on this everyday practice. However, there's nothing sensational about this behavior. No one in the safe house is out of control for the most part. Everybody keeps it together or they get dealt with by Warlock. For people living so close to the edge of death, the excessive consumption of drugs and alcohol is a necessary evil. You need it to relax, Warlock assures me. And it's true. He seems to be much calmer and less stressed out once the cocaine comes out. It's a poor man's Xanax after a long day at work. I snap a photo of Priest as he exhales. He turns and glares at me. I've learned to be slightly afraid, actually I've learned to be a lot afraid, of those who don't talk and just stare at me. Don't worry about that dude. He don't say shit, but he a good soldier. He a good soldier, Warlock says as he points at Priest. I've known this dude for a long time, he says. He's from one of the most dangerous neighborhoods in San Pedro Sula. He's fucking crazy. By good soldier, Warlock means he can ask Priest to do his bidding with no questions asked. By, quote, fucking crazy, he means that Priest is someone who can be relied upon to do the most dangerous and serious jobs required by this gang. In essence, killing people for money. There's always at least one Priest in every crew. I like Priest, though, and he seems fascinated by me. He loves posing for the camera. Head tilted back, eyes half shut, smoke billowing from his mouth like some kind of demon. He's got menacing down to an art. It's too bad, though, that I can't publish the bulk of those portraits. The most intense individuals in this community, the most violent, are the ones that I photograph in the shadows or as unidentifiable silhouettes. Shooting indoors with poor lighting and no flash makes people appear more looming and ominous. And I worry about images of young black men cast in dark shadows, engulfed in plumes of marijuana and crack smoke. Potential racial stereotypes and photoethnographic practice constantly collide head-on in these encounters. Still, Warlock and a lot of his soldiers, they like it. It adds to the persona that they publicly cultivate on their own social media. They love it when I can make them look terrifying. In the increasingly violent world of smuggling migrants across Mexico, good smugglers, or guides, guías, coyotes, they either need to be fucking crazy or have soldiers under them willing to do whatever is necessary to protect themselves and their precious human cargo. Gone are the days when someone could set out from Central America and hitch a free ride on the Mexican freight trains known as La Bestia, the Beast. The transnational gang, Mara Salvatrucha, MS-13, Trump's new favorite target, these folks control large sections of the migrant trail that cut across Mexico, and I'd be happy to discuss the disorganization of this group in the Q&A. These folks control large sections of the migrant trail across Mexico, but Mexican drug cartels control key geographic points throughout the country. Migrants must pay a quota or a fee to both groups numerous times, or they face robbery, kidnapping, or something much more grave. The safest and best guides at the moment are those with a gang affiliation, either MS-13 or some other transnational gang. Pick your poison, 18th Street, Crips, Bloods. If you want to guarantee your safety while migrating, it's best to hire someone like Priest to guide you. Warlock estimates that the vast majority of guides now moving across Mexico are associated with MS-13. Thus, to understand smuggling at the moment means to look at the complicated, difficult, and dangerous lives of the gangbangers who largely control this market now. This is why I'm in a dank cement room on the outskirts of Mexico City with Warlock, Priest, and the rest of the crew. Since 2015, I have been trying to understand what the daily lives of smugglers, both low-level soldiers and crew leaders, what their lives are like, and I've tried to represent those experiences using a combination of text and images. Today in this talk, I'm going to explore two basic issues. Number one, how is human smuggling across Mexico structured in this current era? And two, what can be gained by deploying a camera in this difficult ethnographic context? What can be learned by reflecting on the logic of one's own photoethnographic practice? But before we can do that, I think I have to give you a crash course in immigration history of the last 2 years in Mexico and with help from the United States. In 2014, a program was announced in Mexico called Plan Frontera Sur. This was a program initiated by the Mexican government with full support, actually quite a bit of economic and political pressure from the United States. You might remember in 2014, the summer of 2014, front page of the New York Times, front page of the LA Times, we were being told that the U.S.-Mexico border was being overrun by small brown children, dangerous small brown children, who were being stuffed into adult detention centers. And then that went away suddenly. It was on the front page of these papers. We were concerned about this human rights crisis, and then it disappeared. Obama came out and said, well, we've gotten tougher at the border. We've secured the geopolitical boundary. We actually did very little at the U.S.-Mexico border and did a lot of stuff within Mexico, Plan Frontera Sur being the primary thing. This was a program that Mexico argued was going to bring control to the chaos of undocumented migration across Mexico. And more importantly for them, or at least the argument for them, the big selling point, was that it was going to protect the human rights of all involved. What this ended up doing is making Mexico, especially parts of southern Mexico, begin to start looking like parts of southern Arizona. So dozens of new checkpoints, permanent and temporary detention centers, hundreds of new agents on the ground, border patrol, Mexican border patrol in all sorts of places. And I'd be happy to talk about this as well as it's going on currently in Honduras and elsewhere. What we ended up seeing is an increase in the show of force for immigration agents, as well as a spike in deportations by Mexico. And if you look at the numbers, at least the numbers that are currently available, Mexico's been a little cryptic about how much they're deporting these days. But it got to the point where they were deporting more people than we were from Central America, something that had never happened in previous generations, and is currently still going on. And you know, this is all happening with the support of the United States federal government. And I'd be happy to talk about conversations that I've had with U.S. Border Patrol agents in places like Central America as they're training these foreign governments to help stop their own citizens from leaving country. But an enormous spike in apprehensions and deportations. And for today's talk, what I really want to focus on is the fact that it didn't protect anybody's human rights, but it actually has made things 10 times worse for migrants and everyone else involved. So there was an obvious, we all saw it coming, a spike in human smuggling costs, in dangers, in extortion, kidnapping, murder, all of these things that have been happening in response to this new policy. And the argument that I'm not going to make too much today, but I'll just make briefly, is that Plan Frontera Sur and programs like it, which we've been doing with increasing frequency in recent years, this is simply an attempt to move the U.S.-Mexico border down to the Mexico-Guatemala border so that we can get Mexico to do our dirty work, so to do the deportations, to do all of the sorts, to do the beating back of these migrants, which happens off camera and away from prying American eyes. And so it's in this context of Plan Frontera Sur that I've been trying to understand the way in which human smuggling has now evolved. But the first question I think I need to address today is, why would you want to bring a camera into this difficult context? Telling you that I'm doing a photoethnography on the lives of Honduran smugglers, illegally moving people across Mexico, should raise a bunch of ethical questions immediately, if not a series of red flags. It sure as hell does for me. How do you research ethically in a context where drugs and violence are not just the norm, but they're actually part of the job description? They're expected. Why try to photograph this organized chaos? What is gained and what is potentially lost or put at risk when these lives are captured on film? These are questions that I have struggled with since I began this project in 2015. I would argue that my interest in human smuggling has been a natural progression from my previous work on clandestine movement and border security that the Undocumented Migration Project has been doing since 2009. The questionable ethical and methodological decision that I've come to photograph the world of smuggling has also grown out of my previous work in visually documenting the experience of migrants in hopes of finding new ways to represent this old and poorly understood phenomenon, but also in hopes of perhaps opening up this world to an audience that doesn't want to read boring ethnographies. Part of this work was inspired by Jeff Schoenberg and Philippe Bourgois, two anthropologists who I have a deep respect for, who write in their use of photography and ethnography that, quote, a long-term ethnographic relationship that they see combining text with photographs creates a medium that is more than the sum of its parts analytically, politically, and aesthetically. And I do truly believe that. But I also oftentimes, now in this mid-depths of this project, I oftentimes think about the notoriously elusive curmudgeon street photographer Gary Winogrand, who never liked answering questions about why he took pictures. But he did once comment, quote, I photograph to find out what something will look like photographed by me. So I guess in some ways I want to see if I can visualize this complex world in some kind of new, nuanced, or meaningful way. And I know that photography, if I take it seriously, which I've only been taking seriously since 2015, if you take it seriously and give it deep anthropological thought, or maybe anxiety, that we can push the boundaries of what ethnography can look like, or better stated, what it can feel like. Hence, the camera for me has become an important fieldwork tool, not just to produce data, but also as a form of practice, ethnographic practice, that is shaped by and reflects my position and understanding of the world, both my own world and the worlds that I seek to study from the outside. These photos, they're not simply means to illustrate the text, although occasionally they do that. I take pictures to document a moment of light, of time, and action. I take pictures to remember or catch things that I did not see with the naked eye. I photograph to provide partial glimpses for difficult to access worlds. I take pictures because there are some things that cannot be conveyed in words. My photoethnography on smuggling is not just me taking pictures of smugglers to illustrate words that I will later write. I hope to produce new layers of understanding through visuals that can complement, contradict, and complicate the ethnographic authority that I claim to own by writing down and theorizing about the things that I have seen and heard in the field. Margaret Mead, a very famous anthropologist, she once argued that ethnographic fieldwork begins in a state of naivete, and that observations become increasingly more relevant with time. However, in that same paragraph, she wrote that photographs for her provide a constant and steady record of human behavior that she says was neither naive in the beginning nor experienced at the end. It just was. Photographs for her could function as a, quote, automatic correction on the variability of the human observer whose cultural understanding is necessarily slow in developing. I want to argue the opposite today, that my photoethnographic practice and process evolves alongside my cultural understanding of human smuggling. I don't claim to present photographic truth, but rather I give you my changing vision. In addition, unlike a journalist or a photojournalist, which I seem to be being accused of in recent months, no offense, I love journalists, but I keep being called one in not so positive ways, I think, which I'll be happy to talk more about. But unlike journalists, who people want to confuse me with, I want you to know that I was in these places. I want you to know that I was there and uncomfortably close, and that all parties involved felt this discomfort, especially when it came down to releasing the shutter. And I guess nowadays I find kinship with photographer Eugene Richards, who writes, when talking about equipment choices, and he says, you know what, the 35 millimeter lens, which is a fixed focal length, very close, semi-wide angle lens, he says, it's normal for me. That's normal in practice. It forces me to get in close. I rarely use a telephoto, he says. In fact, I get closer to people on the street because I had to get close to them physically because of the camera restraints. The wide angle produces some slight distortion, he says, which makes me aware that a photograph is not wholly real. The deformation is almost expressionistic. I like that element. It's a reminder that I am the recorder, he writes. By being there, I am changing things. I like lens flare and disturbances within the frame because they make you aware that this is a filmic experience instead of it being real life. So today, I will talk about this filmic experience and attempts to document real life through my own personal vision. But it's a work in progress, and one that I think you'll come to understand as being totally anxiety-ridden. But I find it intellectually and ethically helpful to talk about the details of this practice with you today. And I guess in some ways, this is my anthropological group therapy. So to do some discussions about photography, I'm going to flip John Sarkovsky on its head. In this talk, I will draw on very famous American photography curator Sarkovsky's articulation of photography's 5 formal elements: the subject, the detail, time, frame, and the vantage point. I'm going to isolate these elements a little bit, but I won't ignore the cultural, political, or social context in which these pictures are made, a critique that some have leveled at Sarkovsky. I'm actually going to do the opposite. I'm going to provide insight into the practice of picture making in the field, and I will highlight the complicated relationship among visual documentation and representation, technical and compositional decisions, and an ethically aware and reflexive photoethnography of smuggling. So let's get started. The thing itself, subject. Sarkovsky writes that, quote, photography deals with the actual, which really isn't that helpful when you're trying to photograph something as murky and shapeless as human smuggling. A simplistic explanation of this process would be something like, smuggling involves paying a smuggler to transport you illegally across an international boundary. The problem with that definition and many attempts to understand this process is that this thing is complicated, it's dynamic, it's multi-layered. Moreover, describing or photographing a, quote, typical smuggler or guide is problematic and akin to making photographic representations of cultural or racial types. There is no one kind of smuggler, and no person is only a smuggler. These communities are diverse and dynamic. There are the OGs, the intense dudes, the sicarios, the assassins. And then there are the wannabes, the hangers-on, the junior soldiers, people who Warlock bosses around like children. Gophers, teenagers who you can send on drug and grocery runs. Runts to make fun of. And then there are others who work more straight jobs and can be relied upon to fix your Mexican visa papers or pick up money from Western Union because they've got a clean ID. Those who physically guide people across Mexico tend to be men. But there are plenty of women in this community/business who have their own hustles, some legal and some not. There are also plenty of children running around just being kids. Everyone is constantly moving and trying to make ends meet. Gangbanging, smuggling, and migrant communities in Mexico are superimposed onto one another. Now, obviously, anthropology has a long and tortured history of photographing its research subjects. It's thus no surprise that few of us today publish portraits of the people that we study, despite the fact that most of us bring cameras into the field. When we do publish photos, pictures of people often are totally absent. They're composed in such a way that individuals appear as abstract figures or headless, or their faces are blurred out. Or my favorite, we make them look like they're wearing VR goggles. This is a piece that I did many years ago. It's seldom that ethnographers give the people they write about the opportunity to look back at the viewer. This is perhaps because we, the anthropologists, we don't know how to interpret the meaning of a portrait. It makes us super uncomfortable when the other gazes back. Elizabeth Edwards has summarized this feeling with respect to 20th century preferences for anthropologists taking pictures of people as if they're looking through aquarium glass. Looking into the camera, she says, in self-conscious representation, well, that marks the presence of the subject, the author, and the viewer, and it challenges the authority of the anthropologist as it disrupts the sense of immediacy, spontaneity, and naturalism on which observational validity and illusionistic representation is grounded. Right? Don't look at the camera, act natural. I'll talk about that in the Q&A because it's a funny relationship that I've come to have with the people that I work with, yeah, lots of interesting stories about what it means to look natural. In the 21st century, ethnographers, we generally defer to the institutional review boards at our home institutions to tell us what we can and cannot photograph. And we typically remove our interlocutors from any decision about the reproduction of their likeness. We act as if the people that we photograph, who live major portions of their lives on the internet just like the rest of us, we act like they don't understand the global circulation of images, including their own. And every time I show this picture, I'm always reminded that Felix told me, he says, I want you to show this picture to the gringos. And you let them know that we migrants, we have our drinking well controlled. Those guys write way better captions than I ever could. By not publishing pictures of people's faces, we keep our informants invisible, as if we're somehow protecting them from the evils of the outside world. And it's rare that we take people seriously when they tell us that they want their images to be seen. If you go down to southern Mexico right now, you will see that there is no shortage of desperate young Honduran men on the Mexican migrant trail. People fleeing poverty, violence, and death. People fleeing the political instability that has been fostered by U.S. Interventions over the years and other sorts of things that we've been doing to Central America. People fleeing these things in search of something better, or at least something safer. Some will make it north and try their luck crossing the U.S.-Mexico border. Some will stay in Mexico and try to make ends meet as an undocumented worker or asylum seeker. Others will find easy money through the wild and attractive world of smuggling. Those who take on the role of a smuggler can come through this occupation through all kinds of routes. Because of the increasing involvement of transnational gangs in this process, I have become interested in gangbangers turned guides, like Warlock and some of his crew, as well as the disenfranchised and highly vulnerable youth from Central America who get involved in smuggling because of easy money, which by default means they get involved with transnational gangs. Chino. If Warlock is a king, or a rey, as Hondurans will often call each other as a term of endearment, well then Chino is a foot soldier, a soldado, a young man who left Honduras when he was 17, the wildest of many children being raised by a single mother in a dirt floor house with no running water. He figured he was more help to everyone if he was out of the picture. One less hungry belly to worry about. He spent much of his teenage years getting into trouble on the streets of San Pedro Sula and later riding the rails across Mexico. He has just recently turned 20, and he and I are sitting on a rickety bench next to the train tracks in the southern Chiapas town of Pacalna when he starts to talk about the cyclical and seemingly endless journey that he has been on. He says to me, "I've ridden the train a lot, coming and going, coming and going. If they catch you, immigration, they'll send you right back to Honduras. But you learn, and you go around that place the next time." Until then I ask, "Well, how many times have you tried to cross the U.S.-Mexico border?" "Man, like 5 times. Once I got across and I was hiding in a tree in Laredo, Texas. It was incredible. I climbed up there and I put some wood in this tree to lay on," he says. "I had my little bottle of water and my backpack tied up there. I had my cigarettes and my lighter. I was in my little house, in my little casita. I slept up there at night. I was sleeping in that fucking tree for 8 days, man," he says, laughing. "Seriously, immigration would come through to try to find me, but they couldn't find me. They didn't see me. Chino was up there, hiding in the tree." And Chino loves to talk about himself in the third person. He says, "Chino was up there," he says. They couldn't find me. And then they caught me at a 7-Eleven when I was coming out. "I was in Texas for like a month," he said. "But the problem is you get across the border and then what are you going to do? Where are you going to go?" "On the street," he says. "That's where." After failing to join America's undocumented labor force, Chino fell into work in the train tracks as a soldier and a guide for MS-13. He had developed the necessary skills for this type of work during his involvement in various gang and criminal activities in Honduras. He became disillusioned with the violence that he was surrounded by in his home country and the poverty that his family was living in. He explains to me why he left. "I could go back to Honduras if I wanted to, but I would have to kill people. I could go back and I would have women, cash, and drugs, but I would have to kill people whenever they told me to. I don't want to live like that anymore," he says. His story is typical of young guides, soldiers, kids who attempt to migrate to the U.S. but find it easier to connect up with a gang and see if they can make it work. What does it mean for me to do a photoethnography of undocumented migration and smuggling if I'm afraid to show the people themselves? The portraits that I make of migrants and smugglers in the midst of their dangerous journeys and violent occupations are anything but clandestine. These folks pose for the camera. This is how they want to present themselves to an imagined audience. They hope that you will look at them. Perhaps by seeing these faces like Chino's and experiencing their direct gazes, you will enter into what Ariela Azule calls a social contract with these folks. The relationship that we form with those who stare back at us, in other words, may open up possibilities for action and new forms of visibility, which we as viewers may find difficult to ignore. The subject of smuggling is impossible to reduce to a single image, but its ambiguity and complexity, I think, can be felt if we stare hard enough at it. But for this social contract that I'm talking about, this social contract between me, you, Chino, and everybody else in this room, for it to be effective, I have to sell you on Chino the person, Chino the worthy ethnographic subject. His gaze has to be contextualized. This social contract has to be clarified. I deeply struggle with how to visually represent Chino and his complex experiences. Unlike seasoned veterans like Warlock and Priest, Chino still has the chance to opt out of this life. He's only a few years into being a soldier and potentially could find some stability and a way out. Can he be photographically reduced to smuggler, or in this case, a soldier with a simple caption? Probably. I could also choose to photograph him in the shadows and out of focus like I do with Warlock, try to give him some mystique. I can maybe use the camera to make him appear wild as he occasionally behaves. How do I visually represent my friend Chino, the soldier, the drug addict, the young man who boasts of having killed people, the kid who intimates to me that his favorite part of smuggling is when he trades women his protection for sexual favors? Or do I tell you all these things and then show you the smiling and optimistic face of a vulnerable youth caught between violence and poverty at home and violence and poverty on the migrant trail? The detail. Sarkovsky writes, quote, "The photographer was tied to the facts of things, and it was her problem to force the facts to tell the truth. She could not," and I'm changing he to she, Sarkovsky was not that forward-thinking. "She could not, outside the studio, pose the truth. She could only record it as she found it, and it was found in nature in a fragmented and unexplained form, not as a story, but as scattered and suggestive clues." He writes, "The photographer could not assemble these clues into a coherent narrative. She could only isolate the fragment, document it, and by doing so, claim some special significance, a meaning which went beyond simple description." In other words, what he's saying is the photographer selectively chooses the details and then makes a case for their significance. This sounds a lot like some perspectives on ethnography. I would prefer, though, to think about photoethnography as an endeavor that is simultaneously retrospective, it freezes a moment, but it's also a collaboration, perhaps what Tim Ingold would call a work in progress. People making themselves visible and the person behind the camera making technical and aesthetic decisions about that particular moment. The image is retrospective and an active collaboration. That is, Azoulay argues, perhaps extends into real time every time one of these images is viewed. Mid and low-level Central American smugglers in Mexico have relatively short lifespans. Being in his early 30s, this makes Joker, much like Warlock, a veteran, an OG, a survivor. It helps that he is charismatic and funny. Every time I visit Joker, he laughs and says he's going to tie me up and take my shit when I try to leave. I'm pretty sure he's joking. He's taught me a lot, though, over the years. I now know how to make homemade body armor in preparation for a prison riot. I'm increasing my lexicon of Spanish words for sex organs and drugs. I'm also learning what questions not to ask him. Joker is animated, especially when he's partying. I've never seen anyone mime a knifing with so much conviction or improvisation. And it's in those moments with him that I can't tell if I'm looking into the past or to the future. But I'm not sure that it matters. In the field, I often shoot with a battered 35mm black Nikon F3 camera. It's covered in electrical tape to make it both less conspicuous and to lower its estimated resale value. When I shoot in color in the jungles of Chiapas, I often use Kodak Ultramax 400 negative film. It's the cheapest 35mm film that Kodak currently makes. I prefer its vibrancy to the more muted colors of the higher end films like Kodak Portra. Kodak Portra often reminds me of middle-class American wedding photos. This is not a middle-class American wedding photo, but it's shot with Portra, and if you have an analog photographer shoot your wedding, you can oftentimes just ask for the Portra package to give you this particular kind of look, and they even make filters in various software programs that will give you this sort of lighter, kind of subtle coloring. Ultramax, however, which I prefer, has a slight distortion. It's a janky film. I mean, it's the working class Kodak version of 35mm film, and I like it because it's distorted. I prefer it to the higher grain and clarity that you find with more expensive and lower ISO films. For me, this film breaks up like an overdriven tube amp. It does a good job of capturing the overpowering color and the brutal sunlight of southern Chiapas. It's sun that can sometimes make your teeth hurt and your body ache. The saturation and grain structure of this particular film, I think, also convey a certain ethnographic tone. It works well with darker skin compared to Portra and other films that often make brown and black people's skin look yellow or ashen. This is an example of Kodak Portra, which it's a little hard to see with the PowerPoint, but when you get up close, dark skin gets kind of blown out here. Cultural critic Lorna Roth has written extensively about the racialized color balance and dynamic range of Kodak films that took years to correct, and only after candy vendors and furniture makers complained that these film stocks weren't accurately capturing the differences between milk chocolate and caramel, or mahogany and oak. Nobody cared that black people looked like they were ashen ghosts. Only later did manufacturers at Kodak explicitly acknowledge that all photographic color balance was calibrated for white skin, which is why non-white skin often looks bizarre or detailless in old-timey photos. Still, some executives at Kodak refuse to discuss race in the context of what these different emulsions are good for. One executive, when pushed about what Ultramax was supposed to be good at photographing and why it was being marketed to working class, in this case, largely people of color, he said, well, Ultramax is really good for something like photographing the details of a dark horse in low light. And nobody wants to talk about race in this context. But I can confirm that in 2017 and 2018, not all film stocks are racially enlightened. And I had to discover the benefits of using the cheaper Kodak Ultramax Gold after a lot of experimentation and frustration of trying to photograph dark skin with more expensive film. I digress. Now back to Joker. Joker loves it when I take his picture. And I guess that's why he doesn't really care when I get right up into his face with a macro lens on this camera. Because consistently he says to me, I hope this one ends up in the book, bro. I hope this one's on the cover. He spends most of his time outdoors and shirtless, which means he's permanently tanned a golden brown. And his body shows the colorful wear, tear, and the handmade markings of someone who's made a living for years on train tracks and other places where an intimidating physical presence is an occupational asset. I shoot black and white photos of Joker in those rare moments that we find ourselves indoors, but it never feels right. When I render him in monochrome, it's as if I'm missing something about his character, his lifestyle, and his working environment. I shoot Warlock in black and white, largely in black and white, because we spend much of our time indoors in poor lighting conditions where color film doesn't really work. Warlock doesn't seem to leave the house because he worries for good reason about getting killed. Also, being black in Mexico means that you are subject to the daily harassment, discrimination, and potential assault by law enforcement and locals. Racism keeps Warlock indoors. Racism and his personal safety often dictate the types of images that I'm able to make of him. But Joker will tell you he doesn't look good in black and white. He doesn't do indoors. I could tell you a lot of stories about Joker and his crew of fair-skinned, light-skinned, mestizo Hondurans and Mexicans that involve violence, sex, swindling customers, snorting cocaine, and freebasing methamphetamines. These are details that people expect to hear about smugglers, about coyotes. These are interesting and important details, but they don't completely define those individuals who undertake this dangerous occupation. Because Joker would prefer to talk about his family. I love my kids, bro, he tells me, as he kisses the invisible rosary around his neck and points to the heavens. The numerous cell phones in his pockets store digital pictures of his toddler son that he loves to show off. He also loves showing off wire transaction receipts, showing the money that he has sent home to pay for diapers, medicine, and food. It's money that he has made from smuggling people and sometimes ripping them off. People that I trust have told me that my friend Joker is a very bad person. And yet every time I speak to Joker on the phone, he ends our conversation by saying, God bless you, bro. Time. Time on the migrant trail cannot be measured accurately with a watch or a calendar. This is because it has its own sociocultural logic. It contracts and it expands in response to the social forces and the complex spatial dimensions of the world of clandestine movement. I would argue right now that migrant and smuggling time is fairly slow, as everyone is waiting to see what happens with this current U.S. administration. But everyone knows it'll pick up again. And when it does, someone like Warlock or Joker will give you just a few hours' notice before you have to be ready to leave your home and perhaps kiss your family goodbye for the last time. You might spend 2 days looking at the lush Guatemalan countryside through a cracked bus window while you quietly repeat your aunt's cell phone number in your head. Having that number burned into your brain will be helpful because Mexican immigration officials near the Rio Suchiate, with the border with Guatemala, those guys will steal your wallet and your cell phone. Out of duress, you will later find yourself saying those same numbers out loud while padlocked to a wobbly chair in a muddy colonia on the outskirts of a place called Coatzacoalcos. This is because Joker has sold you out to some kidnappers. You can see the feet of mangy dogs passing outside a crookedly hung door. And you ask yourself, is it morning? Is it dark? So much pain distorting your sense of time. But you just keep saying those numbers out loud. You say anything to make them put the lit cigarettes and knife away. Sometimes migration time is painfully slow, and other times it moves brutally fast. It contracts and expands, it stands still and it speeds up. It's as fast as a 60-mile-an-hour freight train and as slow as the days it takes for your sister to wire money to pay Warlock to get you to the next stop on the train tracks. It's as slow as the long days waiting for new customers or victims on the train tracks. If you're Chino, maybe you kill time by getting a homemade tattoo. You hope that sharing the needle with 6 other people doesn't later kill you. Maybe you pass the days monitoring the healing process on your catracho, which is slang for Honduran, your tattoo. You use that as a way to measure how long you've been waiting for something to happen. Smugglers and migrants will tell you that they have all had to recalibrate their internal clocks to deal with these wide temporal fluctuations. As anthropologists trying to understand this process, we too have to recalibrate our clocks to better understand this dynamic social process that has no fixed coordinate and is subject to erratic time changes like a John Zorn composition. This culturally specific form of time, it becomes really interesting when you try to photograph it. Do you shoot on burst mode? Do you use a tripod? Does the blur of a slow shutter speed capture the essence of this clandestine movement? Is it possible to find what Cartier-Bresson calls that decisive moment on the train tracks in Pacalna? Or should you look for something else? What is the opposite of the decisive moment? Tsarkovsky writes a quote, "There is in fact no such thing as an instantaneous photograph. All of these photographs are time exposures of shorter or longer duration. Each one of these things describes a parcel of time." He says time is always present. Scholars recognize that undocumented migration is a social process, but I think we don't understand its dynamic tempos quite yet. How do you photograph migrant time? The frame. A greasy 4-year-old with a poorly sewed hair lip, wearing nothing but tattered khakis. He points to the camera around my neck, and then he mimics inhaling glue out of a plastic bag. He hopes that I will take his picture. He's a child Robinson Crusoe shipwrecked on the train tracks. A skinny Garifuna teenager lying in bed with 2 broken ankles and a bloody bandage over one eye. A federal agent pushed him off the top of a train. It takes 2 of us to lift him up and put him into a wheelchair so that he can join his friends for a somber lunch in a migrant shelter. Frankie, the kind-hearted smuggler, hits a crack pipe in a dank cinder block room. The lone window pane has no glass and is covered with a pink blanket decorated with Disney cartoon characters. He turns his back to me and, with slight embarrassment, declares, "We all have our vices." My smuggler friend Francisco fighting back the tears in front of a grinning Mexican immigration agent with a potbelly. He musters the strength to tell him to go screw his mother as they throw him into a van and deport him back to Honduras. As the van pulls away, I lose it and begin to cry inconsolably. Is Francisco's association with me what led to his deportation? Has he just been sentenced to death in Honduras? These are images forever remembered without any photographic evidence. Mostly because I couldn't bring myself to snap a picture. I couldn't frame any of these painful or poignant moments. The things we don't photograph are often just as important as what we do. Unfortunately, we rarely get the opportunity to write about the times where the camera was purposely tucked away, or its user too paralyzed to release the shutter. We also don't know what to do oftentimes with the many photos that never see the light of day. They're out of focus, they contain confusing compositions, they've got too much extraneous subject matter in the frame. For example, compare these 2 photographs. This one, this one. Look at them side by side. These images were made 30 seconds apart, with a difference of 45 degrees in angle. I took the one on top, the first one, because I wanted to convey the sense of boredom that often accompanies clandestine movement. I took the second one immediately afterwards because I found it humorous and stereotypical of the boredom that often accompanies fieldwork. That is not a white smuggler. That's my longtime collaborator, Michael Wells there, passed out in the sun. On this particular day, Mike and I had spent about 7 hours in the same spot with Joker and several others, eating, drinking, napping, talking shit, and just trying to find ways to entertain ourselves. So much time spent waiting for something interesting to happen, for something interesting to photograph. Looking at these two images together illustrates some obvious facts for me. First, what makes it into the viewfinder and what is left out is a deliberate decision that changes everything. Framing, in this case, is real-time editing, and looking at what comes before and after a shot can provide some insight into this process. Second, I think the comparison here illustrates the nobility, the supposed nobility, that's characteristic of the low-angle portrait, and the brutally demystifying effect of the wide frame. When I took this picture of Mike sleeping on the train tracks, I never imagined I would do anything with it. And I don't know if he really likes the fact that I keep showing this picture to people. But I keep thinking that if I ever get around to writing a fieldwork manual, that this will be the image I'll use for the cover. Vantage point, final exposure. I once took a class with renowned LA street photographer John Free, who remarked that he found it strange that when people see something that they want to photograph, they often pull out their camera phones and immediately snap a picture. He says to me, it's like they decided from where they were standing that was the best place to take that picture. I think you could say something similar about the anthropological gaze that is often cast upon undocumented migration. An editor of an unnamed academic press that I will not out today, that I had once submitted a paper to, refused to publish any photos that migrants had taken in the Arizona desert while while migrating, because they were deemed, quote, too blurry. I wrote back to this editor that it's probably hard to focus the lens on a disposable camera, number one, because they don't have a lens to focus, and two, it's probably hard to think about focus when you're trying not to die or get arrested by the Border Patrol. And I thought to myself, maybe we don't like the migrant vantage point because it calls into question our authority, our anthropological authority. Maybe these migrant photos remind us of the arrogance, of the supposed clarity that comes with participant observation. And as I've argued in other places, we can never fully participate in these things, nor should we try. Maybe we don't like the smuggler's vantage point because it's messy, ambiguous, and not to sound like a broken record, but to sound like an anthropologist, it's complicated. To quote Sarkovsky one final time, he writes, "To a photographer, the world consists of an infinite number of vantage points, places to stand, of which very few altogether are satisfactory." He says, "The photographer's goal is simple in principle and modest in ambition. Find a place and moment from which some interesting aspect of the world can be converted into a photograph that is clear and lively." I think for me, my favorite viewpoints, my favorite anthropological viewpoints, are the ones that consistently highlight the awkwardness of this entire endeavor. For me, ethnographic practice, this whole thing, involves a steady hum of anxiety, a constant gaze into the mirror, wondering if I'm doing the right thing. Am I asking the right questions? Should I be taking this photo? What does my presence do to those around me? Who is gazing at whom? What kind of spectacle am I making in the field and later when these images circulate? Filmmaker and anthropologist J.P. Snijadecki, he writes about his discomfort with the token moment in research articles when the author exposes, quote, himself and his methods as a way to respond to the ethical complexities and the power dynamics inherent in every act of representation. He writes, he says, look, this moment of self-recognition that you folks are writing about, this one brief reflection, it's just an easy way to brush off these problematic moral entanglements that we have when we try to represent other people. It's your get-out-of-jail-free moment. For me, the anthropologist taking picture caught up in the brutal process of smuggling, there is no one moment of reflection. Just as I can't separate film type from ethnographic tone from the ethics of representation. Constructing the frame, adjusting the shutter speed, these are not separate things from the messiness of culture. Instead, photoethnography of undocumented migration should be understood as one long take in which the technical, methodological, theoretical, and the ethical collide, and they continue to collide long after the photo has been taken. Epilogue. Shortly after I came back from the field in 2015, Chino sent me a picture via WhatsApp. It was a picture that showed him laid out on a hospital bed with a series of stab wounds and a tube draining fluid from his chest. "Look what they did to me," read the accompanying text. Chino had been brutally stabbed by 2 other soldiers on the train tracks after he had decided to leave the smuggling game and return to Honduras. He had been stabbed by 2 people that I had worked with closely that entire summer. This photo that he sent me confirmed what he told me the last time that I saw him. His life was in danger. This photo that he sent to me was a visual cry for help. A cry for help to someone who had taken his picture many, many times. I wrote back with 1,000 questions. How could I be of assistance? What did the doctor say? Are you going to be okay? Can I call you right back? He says, "Don't call me back. I stole this phone from the security guard, and if the phone rings, he's going to know that I have it." Before we could figure out his medical options in Mexico, Chino was bandaged up, discharged from the hospital, and put on a bus back to Honduras. He was given no medication or prospect for follow-up care. I remember it so vividly. It was a very bright morning a few days later after I received this photo. The sun was shining on my bare feet as I stared out the window of my Ann Arbor house. I was looking at my neighbor's perfectly manicured front lawn, but mentally visualizing a photo I took of a goofy kid. A goofy kid standing on top of a train, flashing the peace sign and staring at me, his gaze locked on me. "Maybe this one will go in the book I write about you," I told him that day. It is this mental image that I have while I keep hitting play on my voicemail on this morning. I keep playing this short WhatsApp message over and over and over again. And the message is, Chino is dead. I have to visualize that day on top of a train car because the accompanying photo to that voicemail is too brutal for me to look at. It's a photo that I don't think I would have been able to take myself. But it's a photo that I find that I am not able to run away from. Thank you.
Thank you, Jason. We will take some questions.
Sure.
First of all, thank you so much. I think you provided a narrative that's not really told that often about photography. And as a film photographer, I really appreciate you coming today and listening to you speak. I have 2 questions. I hope that's not too much.
No.
So the first is, I often think that a photograph should be powerful enough without the context that often follows it through narrative. So oftentimes someone says that this photograph is powerful because of the story that accompanies it, and I'm kind of the other thought process, but I wanted to hear what your thoughts were on that. And should I ask the second question?
Sure.
Okay. And then in terms of getting into a community and photographing, especially somewhere where, frankly, there are illegal activities that are taking place, how does that conversation happen between you and leaders of that community, and how does it take place where you're basically saying, I want to record and share these things that you're doing with your face in a way that might put them at risk? I think you talked a little bit about that, but I was wondering if you could touch more on that. Thank you.
No, thank you. Those are great questions. The first one, I think that anthropology is concerned with detail and complexity and ambiguity, and I think that for us, I don't think there's an ethnographer out there who would say that you can have photos without written context. I think that is our bread and butter, and so the photos, the argument could be, is it the one good photo? Do the photos do more when they're in relationship with other photos? Is it the photos with the text or some variation of those things? For me, I think the pictures will oftentimes, they can be powerful and be evocative, but maybe not telling the stories that I want them to tell. And obviously they can recirculate and they can tell new stories later on. And it doesn't matter what I say about the image, it can take on a life of its own. An example I would use is in the book we did in 2015, there are a couple of images of the body of a woman a migrant, Maricela Zaguipuyas, who we found in 2015. And I spent over a year thinking about, do I publish this photo, do I not publish this photo? We published her photo, and then I spent a lot of pages explaining why that is and how to think about that photo. I know very well you could just scan that picture, put it on the internet, and now it's just some gruesome kind of contextualist thing. And for me, it's trying to do is, can I take a good picture, whatever that is, can I put a series of images together, have them become more interesting in conglomeration, but then also, what can I do with the text? And so for me, I deeply appreciate photography on its own, and I think that there are a lot of photographers who tell great stories without any context. I've just been thinking a lot lately about Eugene Richards' book, Dorchester Days, which I think is an amazing study of segregation and racism in the 70s and on the East Coast with very minimal text. But for me, being interested in ethnography, I have to have that there. But I definitely would never, I can appreciate all versions of it. In terms of the access, for me, access has always been easy with this kind of stuff, and I don't know what that says about me, that I can party with anybody, I guess is kind of the, but access was never hard. The issues of legality are the ones that keep me up all day long, every night. And what you'll notice with this talk, and I don't say it, but I do it, you get to see Chino. He's the only person that's ever identified. I've shown photographs from this context. They could be, I have not given you any context, to other than these are people who are in this scenario, and so there's no, this is Warlock, this is Joker. I very much hide those guys quite a bit, even when they want to be highly visible. Because of the legality issues, I have to play with that quite a bit, and so we have to have a lot of conversations early on because I record a lot of this stuff. And so saying to people, look, I'm interested in migration stuff. These are the things that are covered by my IRB, legally what I can know and not know. And as soon as you start to talk about something that I don't want to know about, we erase this thing. I turn it off. And that's become hard because I work with folks who have no one to talk about these things, especially like your feelings. And if you've been involved in kind of horrific activities that give you nightmares, people have looked at me as like the free kind of counselor, which I'm not, but I end up playing that role quite a bit, and so that has made access almost like I have to step away quite a bit, but it's a constant conversation, and it'll be one that'll be upfront when this book gets published, I think.
Thank you so much. I feel like I need like a moment to pull it together. This was really intense, and I appreciate how much you shared with us. You said a little bit about the photos you did not take, photos you were not able to take, and the things you sort of framed out of photos. I'm wondering about the decision to photograph and to capture, to focus ethnographically on the smugglers, but I noticed that we did not see folks who were smuggled. And I'm also wondering if you feel like you're able to concretize the really complex, really amorphous structures that are doing the work of sort of pushing and pulling people across these borders so that we can see that deeper story.
No, thank you. That's great questions. It's almost like I have these really kind of difficult, important, challenging moments, and then I don't take a picture, right? What does that say? I'm involved in this activity where I'm saying photography is so important, and then when the most important thing happens, I can't do it. Or for all kinds of, or sometimes I do it and then I'm like, why did I do that? That's a kind of a very much ongoing thing. And there's a book that kind of inspired me. It's called Photographs Not Taken, and it's just a series of short, 1,000-word essays by people who talk about these photos that got away or were never taken. And that got me thinking about what doesn't then get built into the narrative. And I think that I will spend some time in this book writing about that and trying to, if the most important things can't be photographed, why photograph at all? Right? That's a kind of a existential question that I maybe ask myself sometimes. So that's a an ongoing thing. But I do try very hard to photograph everything. And in some ways, the camera is like this protective talisman, because it feels like I'm not, like I'm somehow protected, or at least both because I'm looking through this lens, and it's like this isn't really happening because I'm watching a movie kind of thing. And sometimes I felt like when things got difficult, I would take pictures because I didn't know what else to do with myself, and so it ends up being a kind of coping mechanism for some of the trauma stuff. In other times, people really expect me to take pictures. Like, why aren't you taking pictures? And the camera for a lot of folks, migrants and smugglers, was really understandable. Like, oh, you're a journalist, that's why you're taking pictures, kind of thing. And so in some ways it was almost like just having it with me, even if I wasn't using it, people sort of understood, oh, the gringo's here, he's taking pictures of stuff. That's easier to understand than, what's an ethnographer, kind of thing. I purposely don't talk about migrants in this story because I've spent a lot of time already on other projects thinking about migrants, and I want to tell a different story. I haven't photographed a lot of migrants in this context because when I'm there with smugglers, they're in a very heightened kind of state of vulnerability. And so I purposely avoid taking pictures because you have these smugglers saying, oh, he can do whatever he wants, let him take your picture, kind of thing. And I purposely then avoid doing that because I don't want to be seen as this person who's abusing this power that these other folks are wielding over folks. But I purposely have left that out here, and then even with a lot of the photos, what'll end up happening, I think the kind of take-home message with the book, as I'm starting to think about an outline now, is I want to make an argument that we make smugglers. The monsters that we view on, we blame for the ills of all these things. I want to make the argument that we, especially the U.S. federal government, we have constructed these individuals through U.S. intervention policies, through economic exploitation, through all kinds of stuff. And so it'll be this kind of I want to give a sense of that structure and that history so that then you can say, well, Chino doesn't fall out of the sky and become a smuggler because he thinks it's cool, right? He is part of this long process of constructing these subjects, and and the argument is always, well, what about agency? And so in a lot of these instances, your agency is quite limited because of the intense structures that you're existing in. And so, but that I think will be the take-home message, is that it's not just, hey, look, smugglers are people too, kind of thing. It's smugglers are complicated folks who do bad things, but we can't think about them in a vacuum. And part of it will be to undermine. I was driving to work this morning, and it's like, again with this wall, these prototypes, like, what are we talking about right now? It's like, how are we still having these conversations? And as we're starting to demonize MS-13 again, or smugglers, I want to provide this counter narrative to say, if we hate them, we blame them, then we got to blame ourselves, because we are deeply implicated in this entire process.
Thank you so much. As someone who also studies violence in a totally different context, I'm very interested in your moral stand with respect to, what are your boundaries when you are there present, because you are obviously experiencing a lot of violence going around you that end up obviously in death and other situations. How do you justify not intervening, or do you have a line that you're willing to cross?
It ends up happening that I think that there are a lot of things that are. It's a great question. There are a lot of things that are hidden from me. So I'm sort of shown. I'm given the tour, but I don't get to see everything. Kind of. So there are oftentimes violent things happening in the background that I know are happening, but I don't get access to. And so, and on purpose, people are shielding me from that. People will oftentimes talk about violent acts that they've done, or that other people have done, or they'll talk about it in the third person. I'm interested in those conversations, but in the moments where I've actually been around violence, those are the moments that I've had to intervene in some way, shape, or form. Like I was on the train tracks a couple of years ago, and one of the smugglers that I was with got really upset with this kid, small kid, and started to get physical with this kid. And I just had to basically get in between them and be like, look, I'm trying to be here and not judge anybody, but I will judge you, and I will get physically involved if you try to touch a child, kind of thing. And people, I think, understand that too. That that everybody's got their own limits. And it's funny because the boundaries and the morals are oftentimes set for me by the smugglers themselves. So they will tell me, this is good behavior, that's not good behavior. I remember one of these guys had played a joke on this migrant who was living next door, the smuggler, and she kept leaving her kid unattended, his baby. And so they took the baby. And then she came back for the kid and was like, where's my kid? And they said, oh, the government came and took your kid away. And so she, of course, freaks out. And then these smugglers did it as, then they give the kid back and say, we're just kidding, but you need to be a better mom about this kind of thing. And so given this whole kind of moral lesson. But these are the same people who will tell me that it's totally acceptable to kill someone for money if you're asked to, if they're a bad person. And so I end up having these interesting moral conversations with folks who complicate things for me. But it's, and with this whole thing, I mean, I always thought that, okay, undocumented immigration is such a gray kind of thing. And then I get into the smuggling stuff and it's even, I mean, I just don't know if I'm going left or right these days.
Hola, gracias por estar aquí. I just wanted to ask you how you navigate your own identities when you are taking the photograph. So, like the photographer, I'm not an expert in photography at all, but you were talking about kind of, we all put our own interpretations of our biases, our previous experiences when we are capturing a moment. And so I wonder with, Ibrahim's question before about access, and then also your own interpretations of that moment that you capture, how has being a man, how has being a man who do you identify as Latino? So, a man who identifies as Latino, like how does that impact your work, and how does that impact the ethnographic work that you present to the world?
This is a male-centered talk because that's the population that I have the most access to. And smuggling is highly gendered. I have relationships with some female smugglers, not as many as I have with men. And oftentimes in those spaces, these men determine then who I can talk to. The times that I've tried to branch out, it's always like, no, you're not allowed to talk to these women kind of thing. Or we knew it. You're just a creepy dude with a camera. So there's all these things that kind of complicate access. And but I'm very interested in the role that women are playing in this process. And so I've been trying to I end up writing about them kind of through the lens of the men that I'm around, and then I've got some access to a few folks that I'm going to try to construct at least somewhat of a sort of developed perspective. But admittedly, that being a man puts me in a certain space. And so rather than trying to do, and this is what I did with the last book too, rather than saying it doesn't matter, I can really write well about women too. It was more, I understand that women are important in this process. I can't do justice to it, but I won't ignore it. But I'll talk about it in the ways that I kind of can. And that's sort of what I'm doing with this project. Although I'm a lot more cognizant of these things now and trying to figure out ways to workarounds. But being a man, being a working class Latino, all of these things give me access to these spaces. And I couldn't do. This is an ethnography that I think I was sort of built for, because when I started hanging out with these folks, it was like, yeah, I went to high school with these guys, or these are like my uncles, these are my cousins. And so the poverty, the intense violence, these were unfortunately not things that were like really new to me. And so it was easy for me to get in and start to document this because I didn't have this like intense shock in the beginning. I have some shock, but not what I think a normal person would have. So that sort of shaped, I couldn't do an ethnography on like, a corporation. I mean, I couldn't do something that would require me to be not the kind of jackass that I am. And so, I sort of have gravitated towards things that I think I could do really well. But my own identity has really shaped the access that I have, and I just try to embrace that. I think in a lot of ways. In terms of the photography, I mean, I think I kind of began with this Margaret Mead idea, like I can just document this. I can just take pictures, and the pictures don't lie. And then that was me not ever having thought about photography. I mean, I tell you, I picked up a camera with any seriousness in 2015. I mean, before that, I couldn't have told you the difference between megapixels or a 35 millimeter. So I literally took a crash course in photography, but I sort of came to it in that I've got a lot of good friends who are anthropologists who do photography, but they start as photojournalists, they start as fine art majors, and so they come to the table with a well-developed set of photographic skills that they oftentimes don't remark upon. Like they say, oh yeah, framing, or I like the way this film looks, or I like the way this camera kind of works, but they've just been exposed to that and they don't really think about it. Where for me to show up with all of the anxiety that I have as an anthropologist already, and to say, well, now I've got this new thing, how do I rectify my position in the world with this piece of technology? I took a class at Washtenaw Community College, a couple classes, and I think I was the most annoying student in the class. They're just like, oh my God, again with this guy. He's asking like crazy questions. Because I was so curious. There's a book that I taught last semester called How to Take, read this book if you want to take really good portraits of people. That's what it's called. And I remember picking it up and going, well, what if you're like super racist or you're a misogynist? Like, how does that shape your making of pictures, right? And so I'm coming to this kind of late with all these sorts of hangups, and am then super aware of, when I look at a picture, I go, okay, well, who am I parroting here, right? Did a man take this picture? Can I see maleness in this? Can I see Latino-ness? What can I see in these images? And trying to be aware of that and not think about these images as not being culturally mediated products, but it's more like this is, it's like when people say, well, ethnographic writing, are you writing for the public? Are you writing for a journal? Are you writing for an academic audience? And I just think all of those are styles, right? All of those that's an aesthetic decision to write impenetrably, to write accessibly. And so for me, the photography too is very much has those aesthetic kinds of things. But it's one that I present then as, this is my vision, my photoethnographic vision as seen through photography, and not this is how it was, but kind of this is how I observed it through my own kind of different perspectives.
Thank you, Jason. I'm sure there are many more questions, but for that, we have a reception over there, so please join us for that. And before we close, I want to make sure that we thank Natasha and Brina on the Donia Human Center side for helping set up the photo exhibit and the presentation today. And also Lucy, I think I saw Lucy, who was helping Jason with all the photos and the exhibit. So please make sure to enjoy the photo exhibit and join us for the reception. And please join me in thanking Professor De León for excellent presentation.